Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Discourse Lab. Thank you for joining us. Our guest for you today is Colin Braman. Colin is a PhD student who's studying program and policy evaluation, and he has a background in statistics, research design, and psychology. However, you might know him better by his Instagram handle, Liberty Evaluation. For those of you who don't know, Liberty Evaluation is an Instagram page where Colin posts really insightful videos about free market economics. The guy's got like 23,000 followers and counting because his content really is just that good. I highly recommend you give him a follow. Naturally, Anthony and I are really big fans of what Colin is doing, so we wanted to invite him onto the podcast to give you a sort of free market Econ 101 discussion, if that makes sense. We talk about all sorts of things, including why some nations are rich and others are poor, why tariffs probably aren't a good idea in most situations, and why AI might not be the big job killer that everyone is afraid it's going to be. We cover a lot of ground. It's a great episode, so if any of that sounds interesting to you, then you should definitely stay tuned. I'll also mention that much like in his Instagram videos, Colin is really good about citing his sources. He references no less than 16 different books in this discussion, so if you're not sure what you want to read next, you might find it in this episode. All of the books that Colin references will be listed in the show notes below, along with Amazon affiliate links that you can click on to go ahead and go to Amazon and purchase them. Please use those links if you're thinking about buying one of those books. We get a small kickback from Amazon if you do. It's the best way to support this podcast financially right now, and it costs you nothing extra. So you might as well. I would also ask that you please rate and review us on your podcast player of choice. It takes about 15 seconds. It's completely free, and it really helps us grow our audience. So if you like what we're doing here, please consider doing one or both of those things. It would mean a lot to us. Anyway, I'm done rambling. Without further ado, I bring you Colin Braman.
This is Discourse Lab.
MAGA in Trump 2.0 is a cultural phenomenon.
I'm Anthony Rispo.
And I am Clayton Smith.
Is this the moment where I let you know that I think your therapist is incompetent or inadequate for you?
On this podcast, you'll hear a wide range of perspectives from an ideologically diverse suite of guests.
Social psychologists will just seamlessly import leftist ideology.
It's quite a radical idea, actually, to say that we're going to deregulate banking and big government out of all of these spheres of life in which it was previously involved.
Our goal? To use conversation to analyze ideas, test arguments, and question dogmas.
Terrorist speech, extremist speech, disinformation, misinformation, all of these concepts are inherently irreducibly subjective.
Now, let's head into the lab. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Liberty Evaluation, aka Colin Braman. I think we'll probably call you Colin because Liberty is a bit of a strange name, but
We won't refer to you as Liberty.
Yeah, we'll only refer to you as Liberty, which is actually kind of a cool a sobriquet, if I'm using that term correctly.
It's a lot of pressure, so
yeah, it makes you sound like. Yeah, like it's kind of epic. It's like a superhero. But we're super excited to have you on because I came across your content like I think a month or so ago, maybe a couple weeks ago, and just like tore through it. I thought it was so interesting because I think like a lot of people, I am both very interested in economics and questions about everything from minimum wage to tariffs to globalization and deglobalization, all of these things. And then also am not super well read on the subject, which is something I'm currently trying to fix. But that's why I think I and a lot of others appreciate your content is because it's like, oh, this is very straightforward in terms of the explanations that you give. You reference what you've been reading and where you get the information from, which is super helpful. So I now have like a list of books that you've talked about that I am like, okay, I have to read that on my Goodreads. So it's super great to have you on. I wanted to start off with just in your own words, like a basic origin story for you, because I mean, this is basically the first time I'm seeing your face. You don't show your face on your profile. So I don't know that much about you. So who are you? Where do you come from? What got you into what you're doing and all that good stuff?
Yeah, my name is Colin Braman. I'm currently a graduate student studying program and policy evaluation. It's basically like a applied social science research on government social programs and nonprofits and any other organizations to see if they are having a positive impact on the people that they want to serve and if they can find any areas for improvement. So my background is in psychology with a research emphasis. I got my master's and my bachelor's in psychology. As far as how I got into economics, that was by accident. My brother is an econ major, or was an econ major, and he sent me a Milton Friedman YouTube video to watch. So Milton Friedman is a very famous economist that was making waves in the 70s and 80s due to his push for free market economics. And when he showed me that video, I can't remember the exact topic he was discussing, but it just kind of blew my mind. I'd never been exposed to free market economic thinking before, and it was really frustrating because my whole life I've spent a lot of time watching the news, staying up to date on current events, listening to talk radio, and I thought that would make me knowledgeable about all of this stuff that is happening around us. But what I noticed when I started reading books, starting with Milton Friedman and then moving on to people like Thomas Sowell and Walter Williams and Ludwig von Mises, I discovered that I really didn't learn a lot about why the world works the way it does. I just kind of had a surface level opinion. I would say like, well, I like small government because I like freedom, and that's why I vote this way. I couldn't really explain why. I just knew that smaller government is good, bigger government is bad. So the first book that I got actually was, it's called Free to Choose by Milton and Rose Friedman. This text might be backwards, but it says Free to Choose. And then, so I got started with that book, and I was just fascinated how Milton Friedman and Rose Friedman, his wife, were discussing all of these issues that are relevant for today, like taxing the rich, minimum wage laws, the welfare state. And his analysis really changed my worldview. And then a second book that probably had the biggest impact on me was called Wealth, Poverty, and Politics by Thomas Sowell. Like I said, I stumbled on Sowell while I was watching Milton Friedman YouTube videos, and part of why I started the channel and I reference books so often is because when I read Wealth, Poverty, and Politics, just the first 30 pages, I was actually kind of frustrated. I was like, how come no one has told me that books like this exist? Or how come I didn't know that this kind of information existed and it was so easy to pick up and read? And so that's just been the motivation behind always referencing either a book or an article, mostly books. It's just more fun that way. I just want to encourage people to read more books about these topics, because you go online and you see all these discussions and people are making arguments that were refuted hundreds of years ago. And if people were more aware of these arguments, I think it would be a lot better for our discussion of public policy.
Yeah, absolutely. I know Anthony's about to jump in, but I just want to say one thing is I had wow, I can't talk today. I had an extremely similar kind of experience with a different Thomas Sowell book, which was Black Rednecks and White Liberals, where I read it and I was like, this makes so much sense. But it felt like this is taboo somehow. I don't know. It's interesting. I feel like Sowell is an intellectual who has affected so many people who kind of know about him, and it's not like he is famous, but I feel like a lot of people who don't read as much or who don't pay attention to economics or culture stuff don't really know just how brilliant he is. But everyone who like has read him is like, oh yeah, I had an experience like that with one of his books. So it's just interesting that you bring that up.
He's
It's definitely not
underappreciated.
taught in public schools either.
For sure. Yeah. Much to our nation's detriment.
Yeah. Colin, you mentioned that you're interested in, I loved what you said. You said why you're interested in why the world works the way it does. And so I studied psychology too, and I'm still interested in perhaps getting a terminal degree in the discipline. But one interesting thing is that I'm wondering about is, what about what you're doing now differs from what you could have done had you pursued experimental psychology? Or I guess maybe to put it a little simpler, what about psych or psychology methodology, what does it not offer that empirically in terms of like the tools that it can offer or doesn't offer that what you're doing now does?
I mean, it's very similar methods. I mean, we use the same statistical procedures. We use the same experimental, quasi-experimental designs. So, if you talk to a psychologist or a person who specializes in evaluating social programs, we're all using the same methods. I guess evaluation has a few of its own methods, like logic models and program theory and such. But I guess I really liked these psychological research methods, but I worked in a clinical setting as a psychiatric technician, and
Yeah.
I figured that it wasn't for me. I think I originally wanted to be a clinical psychologist, and so I worked at a hospital. And I
Yeah.
decided
Yeah.
to change my mind. I was like, well, I'm probably more cut out for research than I am dealing with people with severe clinical problems. So
Yeah.
I when I applied for the PhD program, I was looking for any sort of applied research social science program. I was originally looking at social psychology, and I was looking for different programs that offered that. And then I stumbled upon program evaluation. I was like, oh, I didn't know they actually had a degree for this stuff. So I applied and got in. So I can't say that it's been a lifelong pursuit to become
Yeah.
program
Yeah.
and policy evaluator, but the opportunity presented itself, and I ran with it. So
That's amazing, Colin. We are kindred spirits. I mean, it is a parallel. I mean, I'm not in a program right now, but I feel that all the way. And I don't think people understand just how fragmented and diffuse psychology as a discipline is. They think you're studying psychology, you're inevitably going to go into clinical. And I wanted to do the same thing, but was sort of disenchanted for myriad reasons, but also feel a little homeless empirically because you look at social psychology departments and I still am not satiated by what it's offering, So that's some inspiration for me. Very cool to hear that. Yeah, I'm glad you're doing what you're doing. Yeah.
Yeah, it is very interesting. I think when we were preparing for this interview, Anthony and I both agreed that you strike us as a bit of a polymath, right? So you have you have this background in psychology, but then you're obviously pretty well read on methodology and research methodology, I should say. And then, of course, you're also quite well read on the topic of today's interview and discussion, which is economics. And so I do think it's cool that you sort of bounced around between different disciplines. And I think there's a real benefit to that. I read a book a long time ago called Range. I think the author's name was David Epstein, who kind of made the case that having multiple skill sets in multiple things kind of benefits each of those skill sets. It teaches you how to think differently and it gives you new perspectives. And so I wonder if you are benefiting from that effect, and I feel like you probably are. But with that out of the way, I want to get into the the meat of the discussion today, the good stuff. I want to get into the thick of it with economics, because as I said before, you make this great content. You're getting a huge following, and you're clearly someone who's done a lot of reading on it. And so I feel like you're a wealth of knowledge, and I just want to satiate my curiosity, and I'm sure Anthony does too. And I think one thing that we're working on with this podcast going into the new year is really structuring our interviews better and kind of better preparing, and so that they have a better logical flow. And so just for the benefit of our listeners, I'll say we'd have sort of pre-planned this interview to go from sort of like big, zoomed out perspective to a slightly more zoomed in perspective, from like the global to the kind of general to the more specific and more domestic. So with that in mind, I want to start off with the big question on everyone's minds, really for the past, century, which is socialism. Does it work? If so, how? Does it not work? Why? If so, why not? And so to kind of maybe give you a less broad question, I do want to start. Actually, this is a very broad question, but I want to start off with a very simple, something very simple, which is, what is socialism? Because you hear the word thrown around a lot. And I think maybe people have different ideas of what it is in their minds. So what's like a very basic, like foundational definition for this thing we call socialism?
The definitions that economists like Ludwig von Mises would use, like the definition for socialism would be that the government owns the means of production. It owns the factories, the tools, the equipment, the land, and the raw materials that go into producing consumer goods. This is often associated with a planned economy. Soviet and Maoist China governments thought that they could plan the economy and allocate resources scientifically better than through the chaos of the free market or capitalism. The opposite of that, the definition of capitalism would be that the means of production, again, these factories and raw materials, are privately owned and bought and sold on the market. And then entrepreneurs and businesses respond to prices and profits and losses to effectively allocate scarce resources to meet the needs of the average consumer.
So it seems like maybe a good layman's definition would be, or a good way to think about it at least, is in socialism and socialist type structures, you have and I want to even use like, black and white terms. Let's just say tend towards a greater centralization of resource distribution is a kind of like way to think about it. And then in a more capitalist system, you have a more distributed like burden of resource allocation, right? So it's like in the Soviet system, you have like guys in a boardroom basically making decisions for large swaths of territory and population. And obviously the issue is there. It's in the Soviet Union, again, using that as an example, is it's a fairly ethnically, linguistically, geographically diverse area. And so I've heard it said, and I can't remember where I'm getting this from, that like one of the reasons the United States sort of beat the Soviet Union in the Cold War is because of this phenomenon we're talking about, which is the Soviet Union, the computing power, the like organic computing power of, a room full of commissioners and politicians just can't compete with a more distributed like computation model of a capitalist system where the market, this sort of abstract concept, but is in fact a real thing where each individual is making decisions for themselves. And so this ability to it's like in a capitalist system, these resources are sort of naturally, people respond naturally to different demands and shortcomings and surpluses and et cetera. Whereas in a socialist system, you have to have a centralized system figuring all that out. So it actually is, in a sense, computationally more difficult. I probably bungled that a little bit, but does that sound about right?
Yeah, I think this idea was popularized by the economist Friedrich Hayek from the Austrian School of Economic Thinking. He argued that the knowledge, I'm probably going to butcher this as well, but the knowledge that's dispersed among the population, it's consequential knowledge. The car mechanic knows more what he needs, knows more about what he needs in order to accomplish his task than an expert who studies the allocation of of car parts in a central government. And so he would argue that if you want to maximize the productivity of the economy, people should be allowed to be experts in their own domains and respond accordingly. There's an interesting book actually written by Nikolai Shmolev and Vladimir Popov. These are two Soviet economists. It was called The Turning Point, Revitalizing the Soviet Economy. And that was published in 1989. And they actually, their whole thesis was that the Soviet economy is collapsing because we rely too much on central planning. And there are two types of planning approaches that we are using. One of them is called directive planning, where the government says, here are these resources. We're going to send these resources to the factories, and you need to produce this much by a certain amount of time. And then there was indicative planning, where they didn't necessarily force quotas and allocate resources that way, but they tried to manipulate the system by controlling prices and controlling wages. And they just noted that it was an impossible task for the Soviet economists to correctly calculate these prices, because when you change the price in one product, there's a reaction from all of the other prices in the economy. And so what they were running into, they kept running into massive shortages in goods and services, in consumer goods, and massive surpluses. They just were not capable of intelligently and scientifically allocating resources. Whereas in a market economy, the price system is extremely important in a market economy. The price system conveys information about supply and demand, and it also encourages entrepreneurs and businesses to produce the best quality product at the cheapest cost, to conserve on resources. So and so entrepreneurs and businesses will respond to supply and demand. If the if the demand for a product increases relative to the demand for that product, you'll see an increase in prices, and then businesses will respond accordingly. They'll produce more to get more profits, and the people will economize on the resource because it's more expensive, and vice versa. If the supply increases, then relative to demand, then there's a price decrease. You can't do that in a planned economy. You cannot have that quick reaction to changes in consumer preferences and efficiently allocate scarce resources.
Right. So basically, even the most brilliant, high IQ economists who are constantly evaluating the state of their entire nation wouldn't be able to respond quickly enough and effectively enough to have to have the same kinds of results that you would get from just a free market system, basically, in which these sort of responses happen organically. Right. That's very interesting, and it makes me think. So, I mean, we'll kind of like address the elephant in the room. I don't think any of us are fans of socialist systems. Correct me if I'm wrong, Colin, but that kind of raises an interesting question, which is there any merit to it, in your opinion? Are there any socialist success stories that you can think of where it's like, okay, and this actually kind of worked for this country because of this set of circumstances? Or do you come up blank if I ask you about that?
I mean, even people that are against centrally commanded economies, like this is another interesting book. It's called Why Nations Fail by Daron Acemoglu and James Robinson. They actually do talk about how the Soviet Union, for example, was able to make pretty rapid economic progress in a short amount of time due to their centrally planned economies. The Shmolev and Popov, that other book I referenced, they would disagree. They would argue, let's just say that for the Why Nations Fail, they say that the Soviet Union was effective in increasing economic output in a short amount of time, but that over the long term, central planning doesn't pan out for a variety of reasons.
Yeah, well, and it also is worth mentioning that they did so, even if we grant that point, they did so at the cost of quite a bit of human death and suffering and, and misery. So it's like, maybe it's worth taking a little bit longer to get the economy going to maybe save people from some of that.
And again, that's assuming our definition of socialism is that all of the resources, the means of production are owned by the government. That's our socialism. If we want to talk about, people will say, well, what about Denmark? They're socialist, or Canada or China, they're socialist. They aren't socialist by that definition. They do have markets, and people do privately own the means of production and buy and sell them. Ludwig von Mises would say they are interventionist states, so they're not purely free market and they're not purely socialist, but they try to have a mixed economy. So I guess you could say that you can have a functioning society that has a big welfare state. There are countries around the world that are more, they have successful societies. So, I mean, is socialism possible, or is government running things possible? Yes, it's possible, but I think the open market does a much better job.
Yeah, and in keeping with the theme of rapid progress, I guess we could say, pointing to the Soviet Union, as you'd mentioned, this sort of effectiveness, we can kind of maybe say that it's an illusory effectiveness, does not necessarily mean rich. Because if you're going to think of rich, a rich economy, a rich nation, in my view, I guess where I like to go is the long term. Because if you're burning the fuel really high, like in the Soviet Union, the collapse is, well, we have record of it, times how many times. So I guess the next thing I'm curious about is, generally speaking, how do nations become prosperous? So if this centralized concept has not really worked as per socialism, what does work?
Are we talking this century? Or are we talking long term, historical? Because I mean, there are
maybe
multiple reasons why over
Mhm.
history nations are different. They have different wealth, are able to generate wealth differently than others.
Let's make it more relevant and keep it modern, I think, because if you go back to
Yeah. Let's
ancient
do it
times,
from a
it's a lot of like slavery and pillaging, right?
Yeah,
yeah
yeah,
modern
yeah,
that's
because in
good.
Thomas Sowell's book "Wealth, Poverty, and Politics," he goes through all of the different factors that go into why nations throughout history have been more successful than other nations, and that includes geographical features, access to easy transportation through navigable waterways, which allows people to exchange ideas and products. And more isolated societies tend to progress much more slowly than those societies that have a large market for ideas and goods. um I guess the reason why so many nations are poor today, or there are a lot of ways we can attack this problem. So again, in this book, Why Nations Fail, the Daron Acemoglu and James Robinson book, their book, they would argue that nations are wealthy or poor based on whether they have what are called inclusive institutions or extractive institutions. So I have a definition here that they use. An inclusive situation or institution is one where they secure private property. There is an unbiased system of law, and there is a provision of services that provides a level playing field in which people can exchange and contract. And then it also gives people permission to enter new businesses to enter into the market and allow people to choose their careers. Usually, the poorest nations that we see on the planet today have the lowest scores of economic freedom and political freedom. These are what they would call extractive institutions, where a small elite group of people are able to have uncontrolled power in their political institutions to make arbitrary rules and extract resources from society. And then these central governments with a lot of power are able to create economies that extract resources from the people and benefit a small class of people. Usually, the government will institute state monopolies on resources, and they'll extract resources from their people by having oppressive regulations that require people to pay big bribes in order to get approved to start businesses. And it's a big problem. It's definitely not too much economic freedom is not causing poverty in these nations. If you don't make your nation hospitable to do business and to exercise your economic freedom, then you're not going to produce as much wealth as other nations.
It's interesting because we have a faction in our country that would argue that we live under the latter. What was that one? The
Extractive institutions.
yeah. And what would you say to folks who hold that view, as it would pertain here? Or
Yeah, so I guess
perhaps,
people like Bernie Sanders would say
yeah,
we're
that's
ruled
where I'm
by
getting
the
at.
oligarchs, the
Yeah,
millionaires and the billionaires.
yeah,
Good impression.
There's yeah. I don't think there's anything. I think it's exaggerated. I don't think that we are literally controlled by oligarchs, but I mean, even the most free market economists, Milton Friedman and Thomas Sowell would all agree that big business getting into bed with government would be is a massive problem. If these big businesses and big donors are able to get special privileges that benefit them at the expense of their competition or the people at large, then yeah, that's a big problem. So you'll see a lot of lobbying for subsidies and tax exemptions for all of these different businesses and different regulations that make it more difficult for competitors to enter the market. That absolutely can be a big problem. The difference between free market economists and Bernie Sanders or AOC or Zohran Mamdani is to say we need to get government out of the market. They would say we need to get the government out of the market. Walter E. Williams is another economist I really like, and he's written a lot about how the reason why businesses are able to lobby for special privileges is because the government has the power to give out these special privileges. So he was very much in favor of reforming the tax code so that people aren't, our tax code is ridiculously complicated. And that's so, he argues that that's so that political donors and such can get tax exemptions to benefit them at somebody else's expense. So Bernie would say we need to get more government more involved and control more of how business operates, whereas the free market people would say the government getting involved is the problem. So you need to, by whatever method you need to use, you need to restrict government's power to pick winners and losers in the free market.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it's I will have to ask about the tax thing later on. We have that question planned because I have a lot of questions about that, especially now as someone who's like, I own a home, and now I've got all these questions about like where my tax money is going, blah, 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 blah. But I want to keep it kind of on track here because we're obviously talking about, we're talking about like the title of that book, which I actually have on my bookshelf and I need to read, by the way, Why Nations Fail, like rich nations versus poor nations, free market leaning nations versus more corrupt or more socialist leaning nations. There's this other thing that makes me think of, which is globalization, right? So this idea of this globalized economy, which we obviously all live in, especially now in this sort of post-Bretton Woods, post-World War II American-led global order, where free trade globally between nations has been the norm. And people often say that, us competing with a state like China, let's say, where they have this top-down control, they'll say that maybe China has advantages because of this, because they have that sort of state control. They can streamline things. They can do things that we can't because we're too bureaucratic and can't agree on anything and blah, 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 blah. And so you get this sort of anti-globalization. And also they'll say, obviously, that because of also cheap labor, like Detroit got hollowed out and the rest of the Rust Belt. And there are towns that used to have factories that like kept the town alive that are now ghost towns. And so you have this rise in the last decade or two of this anti-globalization sort of sentiment. I mean, you literally have Alex Jones calling people globalists, and this is like a huge insult, right? And so my question is, what has globalized? Obviously, there are pros and cons to everything. I mean, to go back to Thomas Sowell, there's no solutions, only trade-offs, right? It's one of my favorite quotes of all time. But on net, do you think globalization has been good for the U.S. And for other countries, for that matter, generally speaking, for most people in our country and around the world, in spite of maybe some of its drawbacks, or do you think these anti-globalists, like Alex Jones, have a point, and maybe it's not worth it?
That's a That's a good question. I mean, I can't remember who said it, but someone said something to the effect of globalization is a new word for a very old phenomenon. I mean, people have been trading across borders for century, since the dawn of, since man was able to produce more that they could trade and get something in return. Um, I would say yes, it's beneficial because we have a better standard of living now than we did 50 years ago. I know people like to paint the past, the 1950s, as some sort of utopia where everybody had a 3-bedroom house and 5 kids and one job, and we're all working minimum wage and can afford 2 cars. It's largely nonsense. I mean, if you just look at there have been a whole bunch of studies that just show, like, the number of televisions that are in people's homes in the 1950s compared to today. It's like really small percentage of people had central air conditioning, had televisions. A lot of people didn't have cars, whereas today people that are in the lowest income brackets have multiple TVs. Some of them have multiple cars in that household, maybe not for individuals. So I mean, just look at your smartphone, and that's definitely a result of globalization. That's been, all of the component parts are made by specialists in different countries that are able to produce more efficiently than we are. So in the term, like, we keep talking about jobs, like, I think that's where a lot of people worry about. They say our jobs are being taken away because of globalization. What's often forgotten in this discussion is the consumer. The consumer benefits from buying whatever they want at the cheapest cost. It would be pretty ridiculous to say that the consumer is better off if they are forced to pay more for something than they could have gotten elsewhere. Then pay more for something that they could have purchased elsewhere. And I would say that the same thing applies within borders and across borders as well. And then if we look at examples like China and India, I mean, these were in the 50s through the 80s, 70s and 80s and even the 90s. These were very much anti-capitalist societies. They weren't very much in favor of, they didn't have a lot of trade. They tried to protect their industries from foreign competition. They gave massive subsidies to businesses that they thought would be the most, efficient or the best for their competitiveness internationally. The average standard of living for these people was absolutely abysmal. It wasn't until Chairman Mao Zedong passed away in 1978, or post 1979, China began to open up its markets to lower its trade barriers. The Chinese standard of living has improved significantly. Even though I'm very critical of the Communist Party of China, their success is a result of embracing globalization. And so if we enact the policies that made China and India poor, I think that would make us worse off.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. And I mean, it's worth noting that China really needs globalization. It can't grow enough food to feed its own population. If it couldn't import food, people would starve in mass, which, if you know anything about the history of China, actually, unfortunately, wouldn't be that unusual. But your point about the 50s, I think, is one that people don't internalize or know enough, which is exactly that. Like, I think we look at the 50s and the 60s the same way we look at like I don't know, Game of Thrones, right? Like I just started watching the new Game of Thrones series. I'm giving it another chance. The Duncan, the Tall, what is it? The Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. Even though the original series ended so atrociously bad and it was just horrible. And it's interesting how we watch these characters like the knights and the lords and the kings and queens and the kind of scrappy upstarts who go on an adventure, and we really sort of identify with them. And it's the same thing when we look at medieval history of on which this genre is based. We look at King Henry and Sir Richard the Lion, or was it King Richard the Lionheart? and all of these other figures, and we really identify with them, but it's like, we wouldn't have been those guys. You know, it seems like it would be a really cool time to be alive, to be a knight, and it seems really romantic, but like, actually it would have been terrible for everyone. And also, you wouldn't have been a knight, you would have been a peasant, you know, working in a farm somewhere. And it's the same thing with the 50s, but it's stranger with the 50s because it was so not that long ago, you know? It's like, to finish my point, it's like you watch Game of Thrones and you look at the knights, you're like, wow, that's so cool. But it's like, if you were in that world, you'd be the guy that knight killed in a battle and then went home. You know what I mean? Like, you'd be dead. You'd be dead by 22 in that world, like statistically speaking, almost certainly. But and in the 50s, it's something similar. It's like, if you lived back in the 50s, even if you were relatively wealthy, you wouldn't, your TV wouldn't be as good. You wouldn't have as good AC. There's all these conveniences that we have now that you still wouldn't have even if you were affluent. And there's a chance you wouldn't even be in that relatively small pool of affluent people. It wasn't as much of a golden age, I think, as people think that it was a lot of the time. And then just one last anecdote is I'm watching Mad Men with my wife, where she'd never seen it before. And even if you were, you know, super well off like Don Draper and Mad Men, there's a good chance, like if you were the woman, your husband was cheating on you. If you were a man, you know, you were dealing with a crisis of identity and you were drinking too much. And we look at the past with rose-colored glasses oftentimes, and it's just a huge mistake. So I'm so glad that you brought up the fact that the 50s were not what you know, and that's to say nothing of the whole issue of, you know, race, which is a whole nother can of worms, which people don't bring up enough. Right.
Ask a Black American who lived in the South in the 1950s how the 1950s were is probably not as good as it is today.
Yeah, not great.
Exactly.
Yeah, but also I think in fairness, we tend to project our modern sensibilities to the past, and when you talk to people from the 50s, some will lament that our modern times are more unbearable than it was then. I mean, it just depends on the situation, but I see the point. Yeah.
Yeah,
well, hindsight is 20. Yeah,
yeah.
And I'll just say that literally everyone is smoking and drinking. Even the pregnant lady in that show is smoking and drinking. And so it's not a good time to be alive. It was not a good time to be born.
Right.
Well, see, I think another phenomenon that may be contributing to that is, you know, because there are a lot of people that want to go back to the past, and they'll usually say, when I was growing up, it was like this. And I remember watching a segment of The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. I think John Oliver did the segment, and he was talking about, you know, a whole bunch of people like Glenn Beck and I don't know if Tucker Carlson was included, but they were all talking about how much better it was back in the past than it is today. And then he showed a montage of all of these people saying, when I was a kid, and they're all just saying, when I was a kid, it was like this. And then John Oliver, he's like, it makes sense now. It's because you were all children back when all of this, you know, when you were
yeah. That's true. That's a very good point.
You see it through the eyes of you growing up, and then he went and interviewed people that were adults during those times, and they're like, "Yeah, no, it was awful. Like I was growing up in the 40s. I was like, we didn't have anything to do for fun. We'd kick a can down the road. You know, so."
That's true.
Yeah, we need to get some perspective. And again, this is in terms of material production. I mean, if you're a religious person and you believe in, sin and morality, like maybe you could make the argument that we were a more, morally conservative back in the 50s, and we should go back to that. But
that's a good point. Right.
Yeah, in terms of material well-being, I mean, if you traveled back in time and showed someone from the 50s your smartphone, they would be like, "What is this?"
Yeah,
that was insane.
Yeah.
Yeah, it turns out if you had two even relatively good parents and weren't horribly poor or something, just childhood in general is a lot better in a lot of ways. Like mom makes you a grilled cheese sandwich, you go play baseball with your friends. It's pretty easy. That is like a pretty fun time of your life is when you're a kid, right? So that makes all the sense in the world. But I want to bring it back to Econ a little bit and just ask, like, another big part of, you brought it up before, right? Jobs. Like, so another big part of this whole anti-globalization, it was better in the 50s kind of thing, was we had American manufacturing and American cars were better and everything made in America is better and blah, 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 and higher quality. And these jobs were really good jobs. You could leave high school, get a decent paying job, buy a house, blah, 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 blah. And I think there is some truth to that. I think obviously, like if you're an American who doesn't want to go to college or doesn't want to pay for it, the ability to get a nice consistent 9-to-5 job with decent pay, that because of that factory, you can also live in a town near that factory that's like a nice town and have a decent house. That is something that's really nice. And so I understand why people want to bring manufacturing back to the United States, in greater quantities, in terms of the jobs available in the factories that we have and blah, 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 blah. My question is, do you think that is at all feasible to do in any kind of reasonable time frame, and without any kind of horrible side effects? Like, is that feasible as a thing to do, is to bring back manufacturing like we used to have it in the 40s and 50s and all that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know where Milton Friedman said this. It may have been during an interview. I don't think it's written in one of his books, but he says one of the great mistakes is to judge a policy or program on its results rather than its effects, or rather than its consequences. So all of the people that want to bring manufacturing back to the United States, there isn't a lot of evidence that tariffs and subsidizing these industries will bring back any sort of meaningful employment. In terms of manufacturing jobs, Norbert Mitchell, I don't know if it's Michelle or Mitchell, he wrote a book called Crushing Capitalism, and it's a response to a lot of the populist politicians nowadays that are saying we need to go back to the 1950s and we need to institute industrial policies to bring back manufacturing. The problem is that, the 1950s, with all of the manufacturing we did back then, was a really unique time. I mean, we had just gotten out of World War II. Most of the factories, the most productive factories around the world, were blown up during the war in Europe. Their production capacity wasn't very good, so there was a huge demand for American manufacturing labor. And as other countries began to get out of the destruction of World War II, and as several of the Asian countries began to open their markets and make rapid economic improvements, the American worker had more competition for manufacturing. And back to what I was saying about whether the policies will actually produce the intended results, in that book by Norbert Mitchell or Michelle, he points out that even the decline in manufacturing employment has been affecting developed economies all over the world. It's not just the United States that's, sending our jobs overseas or anything like that. He points out, I have a little quote here. He says, 1990 to 2016, manufacturing employment in the United States fell by 25%, whereas it decreased by 31% in Japan and 24% in Germany and 22% in Canada. A lot of these nations were praised in the 80s and 90s by economists like Robert Reich, who ended up working for the Clinton administration. These nations were praised for their industrial policies because, making the Pat Buchanan argument that we're sending our jobs overseas and we're losing our wealth to foreign competition, cheap labor and cheap products and all of that. Even these countries that have instituted the policies that the current and past administrations, this isn't just a Trump thing. I mean, we've put various restrictions on trade throughout, in the post-World War II period in various capacities. I mean, it's been much lower than before the 1940s, but we still have protectionist policies to protect specific industries from foreign competition. And the other thing is that, so industrial policy in these nations hasn't done anything to reduce or to increase the number of jobs in manufacturing. It's also important to note that the United States still manufactures a lot. Just because employment in manufacturing has gone down doesn't mean that our manufacturing output has gone down. We've actually, the value of what we produce in the United States is much greater than it was in the 50s or 60s. If you look at the graph in the value of what we produce, it goes up like this, and then probably around 2008 it goes down, and then it's been a kind of a plateau going up and down in recent years, but we produce so much more because of automation. We're able to get more for the labor. So even if you bring manufacturing back to the United States, will that have a meaningful impact on employment? Chances are not really, because we can produce so much more with so much less labor. So we can't go back to the 1950s when the world was in ruins and we're the only producers on the planet and we can benefit from those high wages. Like that's just not going to happen, and tariffs aren't going to make that a reality.
So we're going to
In my
get to
opinion.
we're going to get to tariffs for sure, but before we do, I'm really ignorant about this particular topic. So I would love some clarification on it. So you'd mentioned, and just correct me if I'm not saying this, if I'm not saying what you said correctly, that other nations, their manufacturing has not necessarily gone up, it's gone down over time, or is that an incorrect way of
I mean, specifically employment.
employment? Okay.
The number of people that are employed. Yeah, I think I don't know which nations are producing how much more than other nations, but a lot of nations are producing a lot more with less labor.
And where go on, sorry.
So if your purpose is to bring back manufacturing jobs, chances are you won't be bringing, even if you bring manufacturing back, it's so automated and becoming more automated that you probably won't get a meaningful impact on the actual number of manufacturing jobs. I guess that's the point I was trying to make.
Okay. That's where does China fit currently into all of this? That's sort of a interesting point of contention, because you see, China, certain products, many products where you see that are made in China, making me think, and many others believe, that China, and of course Trump ran on this whole thing, right, about we have to go after China. But how much is China really producing on its own?
Yeah, so I had made a video a week or two ago. There was
Right.
an Instagram influencer. I think his handle is I am Buddha Wang Wang or something like that. He's a
All right.
Chinese guy. He's a
Okay.
Chinese gentleman, and I don't know if he's based in China or he's in the U.S. If he's based in China, you shouldn't have access to Instagram. So I don't know what what that is. But he made a video trying to provoke people in the United States, where he says, "Hello from China. Look, guess how much stuff I have that's made in the United States in my home." And he's like, "I have nothing." And then he says, "Look at your own home. Do you have anything that's made in China?" And then he starts laughing. And yeah, basically saying, like, we make everything and you make nothing. Douglas Irwin wrote a really good book called Free Trade Under Fire. Again, it's probably backwards. Yeah, Douglas Irwin. This is the fifth edition of his book, I think. This edition came out in 2020, and he points out that a lot of what we import and export to other nations is made from components that are made all over the world by different companies, and then in the case of China, a lot of these different components made in other countries are sent to China, and then China does the final assembly and production. In the example that he used in that book, he uses the example of the iPhone 7. So if you look on the back of the iPhone 7, it would say assembled in China, designed in California, I think. And so when we import an iPhone from China, that's listed on the trade balance of payments, trade deficit, or whatever, as importing $240 worth of goods or per unit from China. Whereas Douglas Irwin says that that's really an exaggeration of what we're importing from China. He says, like, for example, for the iPhone 7, he says the iPhone's flash memory and display module are made by Toshiba in Japan, the application processor by Samsung in Korea, the camera module and GPS by Infineon, which is a German company, and the Bluetooth and wireless LAN is made by Broadcom, a United States company. And even then, it was manufactured in China by a Taiwanese company called Foxconn, so in Shenzhen, China. So a lot of these products we are importing, like on the balance sheet, it'll say that we're importing $240 per unit from China. But the actual contribution to the unit cost of an iPhone from China is actually very small, and most of it goes to these other companies that are creating these component parts. So international trade, to say China makes everything and we make nothing, that's not super accurate, because it's made from a whole bunch of different materials produced all over the world.
I'm sort of laughing because I rented a car a few weeks ago to drive to DC. See, I have a Nissan, but I wanted to save miles for personal reasons. Okay, whatever. And so I rented a car. It was a GMC. And here I'm thinking, oh, this is great. I want this car. I want this. It was a one of the SUVs. I can't remember which one. Listeners probably know right off the top of their head. If it's a Terrain. Okay. And I was thinking, oh, this is great. I love an American car. I'm gonna get it. But now that you say this, I'm thinking, how many of these parts are actually from America?
Yeah. So one of the criticisms against tariffs is that if the tariffs are on any sort of inputs, that's a big problem for American manufacturers. I mean, if you have manufacturers that use steel to make products here in the U.S., but then you put tariffs on cheap steel from China or Japan or Korea or any other country, then you're raising the input costs for these manufacturers in order to protect the steel industry. And congratulations, you saved jobs for the steel workers, but you've lost employment for the manufacturers that use steel and want to use the cheapest steel to produce what they need. So yeah. A lot of what we produce is very.
Sorry, again, I go back to this quote by Thomas Sowell. There's no solutions, only trade-offs. And that's exactly what you're describing with this tariff thing. It's like, okay, you get X number of steelworker jobs, but the trade-off is so much worse. I mean, you get more expensive products because now the steel used to make them is more expensive. You get maybe less jobs in other sectors because the math, the math doesn't work out to where you can expand and grow as quickly, or you have to shrink the company. Or so that's, I think, something people don't think about when it's like, oh, it'd be great if we saved American steel manufacturing or American manufacturing or whatever it is, in some other area of business or production. Yeah, but it's like, what happens to the rest of the economy? What happens to these other sectors that are inevitably and inexorably connected to that thing that you're making or that business that we're trying to protect? But you segued perfectly into the next thing we wanted to ask about, which was tariffs. And so I'm going to take a wild guess based on what you've said already and say that you are not personally a huge fan of tariffs or economic protectionism in general. But I do feel compelled to ask, like, is there any rationale for tariffs? Is there any reason we might want to be targeted, say, for like defense, for example? I mean, is there any way in which Trump's thinking specifically on tariffs makes a certain amount of sense in some capacity?
Yeah, any of the books that you read that I've mentioned, any Thomas Sowell book or Henry Hazlitt, his book, Economics in One Lesson, this book, for example, they will always say that there is an exception for national security reasons. I mean, if we're at war with a country, we probably want to shut off trade with that country. We'd probably, different, some sort of trade embargoes and such. We wouldn't... If we were in an active war with China or Germany, like in World War II, we would obviously want to restrict trade with them in order to, cripple their capacity to wage war against us. Milton Friedman, however, he responds to that argument. He says, well, why are tariffs the solution to the national security argument? So, like, one argument would be we need a thriving domestic steel producing business or manufacturers in our economy, because if we ever need to go to war, we need to be able to produce steel and make weapons and vehicles out of it. Milton Fried, and so they say we need to put tariffs on steel in order to protect these manufacturers in case there is a war. And Milton Friedman says, well, that's a question of cost benefit analysis. Why is that the only option? He's like, why can't we stockpile steel? Why can't the government keep steel factories in mothballs, kind of put them away and maintain them for emergency purposes? So that you would need there are so many different ways that you can attack the national security problem. And he said, Milton and Rose Friedman say that the fact that the steel producers never do a cost benefit analysis for any other alternative approach suggests that maybe they don't really care about national security, and they care mostly about keeping their own jobs.
Yeah, well, you can't blame
So
them for
yeah,
wanting to
that
keep their
was
jobs.
yeah. The problem is you lose jobs in other sectors. So the
Exactly.
main criticism against tariff. So Frederick Bastiat, he was a economist in the 1800s. He wrote a bunch of essays in the 1850s. One was called That Which Is Seen and That Which Is Unseen. And he talked about tariffs specifically. Like even back in 1850, people were saying we need tariffs to protect our jobs from foreign competition because they can produce whatever we produce at a cheaper cost. And he says, well, if you force American consumers to pay higher prices, that leaves them with less money that they can spend on other goods and services. So you've saved jobs in the steel industry, but now everything that's made with steel is more expensive, and you have less money that you can spend in other industries. And so the reason why lobbyists are so effective in getting protection from foreign competition is because they are very organized, and you can see the results of market competition. You can see a factory close down, and you can see towns go under economically. But we need to, a good economist is one that looks at that which is unseen, which is all of the dispersed negative effects. You'll lose just as many jobs, if not more jobs, in other industries. It's just so spread out that there are too many organized consumer organizations petitioning the United States to reduce the cost, to get rid of tariffs so that they can buy what they want at the cheapest costs.
Yeah, it's similar kind of problem you see in a lot of issues in the United States. Is the better solution or the right answer isn't as sexy or as dramatic or as obvious as the wrong answer, to be quite frank. There's so many things that seem straightforward, that seem more easier to understand, and like I said, sexier in some cases. But it turns out that like those policy prescriptions just wouldn't work, right? A good example, and we're going to get to this eventually, is like freezing the rent or rent stabilization seems very like good, and it's hard to argue against. But it turns out it's bad. But you need to understand the underlying economics a little bit better, which is obviously hard to do at scale for an entire voter base. But yeah, no, I think that's a good summation of the tariff issue, and I have to say I agree. I think they are a very bad idea, and one of my least favorite aspects of Trump's overall package of policies. But now I think we want to kind of zoom in a little bit more. We have been talking a lot about stuff, domestic stuff, but I want to get even more kind of local in scale, if that makes sense. And so we're going to sort of switch over to the part of the conversation where we're more focused on the domestic. And I think, Anthony, I want you to ask this first question about taxing the rich, because it's something we've talked about quite a bit. But I'll let you take it.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you have both sides of the spectrum politically and even within their respective sides arguing about what's the best policy for the middle class. And of course, thinking back when I was growing up, when I was 18 during the Occupy Wall Street time, there was a very clear, as there is now, but a much more delineated division between the rich and the poor, at least from my purview, seeing that framework was more visual. And I guess there's been an effort to try to ameliorate that divide between the parties, and the latest one we've seen in the Big Beautiful Bill, which I can't speak to it. We did an episode on it a little bit. We touched on some of it, but there are some provisions in that bill that seemingly help the middle class close the gap. I won't put you on the spot and ask you to dissect that, but I guess the broader question, and if you want to bring that into, if you happen to know some bits about that, is do the rich pay their fair share in taxes? And I guess in holding that question, is there any evidence that any policy that we've had thus far has dealt with that particular question in an effective way?
Yeah, income inequality is definitely a big issue today, but it's actually been a big issue. Like, I love reading books that were written 50, 60 years ago or 100 years ago, because they're arguing about the exact same stuff. I mean, in the 60s, they were talking about CEO pay and how it was too much inequality between CEOs. And now today we're like, if only we could go back to the 1960s when we were all so equal. People back then were complaining about all this stuff too. So I guess the question is, do the rich pay their fair share in taxes? I would say yes, based on another book is called The Myth of American Inequality, written by Gramm, Robert Ekelund, and John Early. This book was published in 2022 and then updated in 2024. They argue that the statistics that we use to show that income inequality is getting worse don't take into account the transfer pay, like government transfers. So they don't take into account the money that's taken away from the wealthy in through the income tax and various other taxes, and they don't count all of the benefits that people in the lower quantiles of the of the income distribution get in the form of government assistance, whether that's food stamps or Medicare or any sort of housing subsidies and such. So when we're discussing the rich and the poor, I think it's important to understand that these statistics are based off of this is pre-taxation. We actually have a lot of wealth redistribution in the United States. I mean, the authors point out that the top 1% of households in the United States pay for about 40% of their income in taxes. And that's much higher than the tax rates for households in the middle class and in the lower classes. So yes, the rich are paying more in taxes than the average American. And then they break it down further and they say, even if we look at the top 400 households, based on IRS income tax data, they pay 32% of their income in taxes. So the rich are paying the majority of taxes, and they are paying a higher rate. Now, when people refer to, the rich aren't paying their fair share, they're looking at a small number of anecdotal examples where, maybe a billionaire Bill Gates donated a whole bunch of money to charity, and therefore he was able to write off a bunch of his taxes. I mean, I don't think that would be a bad thing if a entrepreneur or if a business owner wants to donate to charitable causes, and he or she can write off the taxes. I don't see why that's a problem.
Yeah, and then there's this trope, of course, that a certain subset of the political dimension would say, of which I was a part in my early 20s into late 20s even, is that if you tax the rich more, then you generate all this revenue, and then you can do all this stuff with it. So given what you said that they in fact do, empirically, or just from the analysis that you gave, do in fact pay their quote fair share, what would you say to someone who maintains this idea? Well, I don't feel it. if you tax them according to the way I think you ought to tax them, then you generate all this revenue, and then downstream from that would be all these wonderful things. Like what would you say to somebody like that?
Yeah, I mean, another statistic that they use, so, the top 400 households, according to this book, the top 400 households in 2017, if you were to take all of their income, they said that it would fund the federal government for less than 6 days. So this income that they are making is really a drop in the bucket in terms of government spending. Thomas Sowell also raises an interesting point. He's written a lot about this, or he wrote a small, an essay about it. I think you can get it for free on the hooverinstitution.org, but he also talks about it in this book, Intellectuals and Society. He points out that there's a big difference between tax rates and tax revenues. He argues that you can get to the point where you raise taxes on the wealthy so high that you actually get less tax revenue because the wealthy spend more time trying to avoid paying those taxes. And so that was a phenomenon that was observed by the Secretary of Treasury, Andrew Mellon. Back in the 1920s, he discovered that during the Woodrow Wilson period, they were bringing in tax revenue, a lower amount of tax revenue from the highest income earners, because these income earners were investing in tax-exempt securities, all these different investments that were tax havens. And he noticed that there was a drop in tax revenue. And so Congress wasn't willing to plug up the loopholes with the tax-exempt status for the bonds and securities they were investing. And so he said, well, the logical conclusion is to reduce the tax rate so that the wealthy, people that make high incomes are willing to invest and, take their money out of these exemptions and invest them in the economy to create more economic activity and raise incomes, and that will bring in more tax revenue. And that was very much the case. John F. Kennedy also instituted tax cuts for the top marginal income tax rate, and there was an increase in the amount of tax revenue. So it's an empirical question as far if you want a progressive tax system. It's sort of an empirical question of what tax rate is optimal to ensure that you're not stifling the productivity of the nation and the investment in the private economy. Whether you are, and then if you're bringing in sufficient tax revenue. Thomas Sowell also brings up examples of Maryland and Oregon in the early 2000s. Just a quote here, like Maryland had they increased the income tax on people that were making $1 million or more. And he says, by the time the new tax rate took effect in 2008, the number of such people living in Maryland had declined from nearly 8,000 to fewer than 6,000. And the politicians had projected that they would be, that they would make $100 million. They would increase tax revenue by $100 million, but that their tax revenue for that year actually fell by $200 million. So the phenomenon of the rich trying to avoid taxes is very much is a real thing. So don't assume that if you're increasing taxes by 50% that you're going to bring in 50% more revenue.
Mm-hmm.
So a bad assumption to make.
Yeah, I mean, it just makes all the sense in the world. If you're a person of means and you have the option to go to a place that will tax you less, why wouldn't you do that? And people who have money is freedom. And so people who have a lot of money typically have the freedom and flexibility, at least more than people who don't have as much money, to move to those places where the tax burden is lighter. And that's something that's an issue I feel like people who advocate for higher tax rates have a hard time addressing. But I do want to point out that we're talking about the top 1%, but something I'm curious to know more about is like the top 0.1 or top 0.01%, the super ultra rich. And specifically, there's this thing that they do that I'm sure many of our listeners will be familiar with, which is they will, and in fact, I think like Elon Musk famously does this, and his ilk, like Jeff Bezos, right? They, instead of making like an income, what they do is they have all of these assets that they own, and they'll take out debt using those assets as collateral, right? And and when we say assets, I mean, we're talking about owning major shares or major, controlling portions of multi-billion, multi-million-dollar companies, and lots of property and lots of investments and stock portfolios and all these things. So a huge valuation is what we're talking about in terms of their assets. So they take out. So a lot of people point this out. A lot of people say it's not fair, and that's the way that they cheat the tax system, even though it's not legally cheating. It is all above board. But it does feel kind of skeezy, right? When you hear that, it's like, oh man, they have all this huge net worth, and yet they pay not a very high tax rate, and that does seem kind of not great. So my question is kind of twofold. One, is there a way? I guess it's threefold. Do you think it would be worth taxing these people? Do you think it's not fair what they're doing? I'm curious to get your opinion on if what they're doing isn't ethical or isn't fair, even though it's technically legal. Two, I'm curious to know, if we decide that is the case, is there an effective and fair way to tax them on that debt, or to somehow tax them on the value of their assets in some way that won't like break the system or won't, set a dangerous precedent? And then the last thing I want to know is just financially, is it worth it, right? These people are super rich, but there's not very many of them. So if we did tax them more, would we get any substantial amount of revenue that would make a difference in the U.S. national budget? I know that's kind of a big question, but this is something that I hear people talk about a lot, and I get the feeling there's a lot of misunderstanding around it.
Yeah, sorry, that's a lot to digest. So
Yeah, I know.
the idea that but like the central question, is it fair that they can take out loans and avoid paying taxes using their assets as collateral? I'm not too well read up on this specific issue, but it does sound like the phenomenon that I just described that was observed by Andrew Mellon, which is if the tax rate is too high, then people will find ways of reducing their income so that they have to pay fewer in taxes. So if they, Jeff Bezos says, I'm only making $100,000 a year at my company, or however much, he purposefully pays himself a low income to avoid paying a high income tax rate. And then that's kind of the question of, is it because businessmen and women are just a bunch of liars and cheats and we need to punish them for avoiding the system? Or is it a question of, are our tax rates too high that incentivizes people, productive entrepreneurs, to find different ways of paying themselves instead of using the income tax? Like, I don't know. I think we need to assume that everybody in the United States is trying to pay less taxes. And even the poor, I'm trying to, if you're making $100,000, you're still trying to pay less in taxes. That's a worldwide, that's a, regardless of class, or your socioeconomic status, we're all trying to pay lower taxes, even though we may say we want a higher tax rate on the people above us. So, I don't have I guess there are two ways to go about it. You can try and, find all these loopholes and how to, find ways to plug them up and prevent, get taxes from all these creative ways that investors are using to avoid paying income taxes. But that's the question. Is it because the tax rate is too high, or is it because we need to punish the people that are trying to use here's the thing. In order to avoid taxes, you usually have to pay a lot of money, to make sure that it's legal. So you need to pay money to get your lawyers and all these tax experts to go through your and make sure. So that's a cost. So they feel that they're actually saving money by spending all this money on avoiding taxes. So with my classical liberal sort of, libertarian leanings, I say the problem is lower taxes. I mean, economists like Paul Krugman or Joseph Stiglitz would disagree, but
Interesting. Very interesting. Yeah, it's like just lower the taxes enough to where it makes more sense for them to just pay them rather than spend all that money avoiding them, and you'll end up with a little bit more tax revenue in the long run. So that makes a lot of sense. But we're talking about the super wealthy. We're like the Elon Musks and Jeff Bezoses of and oh my gosh, the guy in Nebraska whose name escapes me, Warren Buffett, whose house I have driven past. I used to live in Omaha. It's remarkably humble for a man of his means. It is a nice house, but he's famously quite not showboaty. Anyway, I digress. I just thought it was interesting. But we're talking about these super wealthy guys, right? But most people aren't the wealthy guys. Most people are not making a lot of money. I mean, the average income is not that high. I think it wouldn't sound that high to a lot of people in like the middle class and upper middle class. And of course, there are a ton of people in this country who are making minimum wage. And so that brings us to my next question is, this is another hot topic, is this idea of minimum wage. Proponents of raising the minimum wage and of a minimum wage in general will say that if you don't have one, then businesses will take advantage of workers and pay them so little that they can barely live off of it. And then they'll also say that even though we do have a minimum wage, if you look at, the rate of inflation, if you account for inflation, the minimum wage in like the 50s, 60s, 70s, whatever it is, would be in today's dollars much higher than it actually is. So it's like, I don't know the exact numbers, but it's like if it tracked with inflation, the minimum wage would be like $25 an hour. And right now it's something like, what is like 15, somewhere in that ballpark. And so they'll say we have to raise it. It's only fair.
Yeah, it depends on the state. Usually states usually have higher income taxes or higher, minimum wage laws than the federal government. I think the federal level is like $7.50 or something. So most states have minimum wages that are above that, the federal level for sure.
Right. The federal level that's a good point, remarkably low. Or at least it would strike people as remarkably low. But what I'm interested in is you do hear this libertarian argument, this sort of free market argument that we should just get rid of the minimum wage altogether. And even someone as free market oriented as myself, I get a little nervous hearing that because I'm like, okay, but won't that mean that some people really will get paid like just a abysmally low wage? Is that acceptable? It's worth setting at least a super low minimum wage just to keep that from happening. So let's start with that concept first. Do you think there's a logic to just getting rid of the minimum wage, or at least keeping it very low, or what do you think about that?
Yeah, so you actually mentioned that a lot of Americans make minimum wage or below minimum wage. It's actually a very small amount of the U.S. workforce that makes minimum wage. So these people that make minimum wage are typically younger. They're just, demographically, on average, they are much younger than the average population. A lot of them are part-time workers, or, they're one worker in a household of, more than one laborer there. So minimum wage jobs are very good for people that don't have a lot of skills, don't have a lot of work experience, and need to get in the labor market and raise their human capital or their skill level. So one reason why the free market, the free market people are against minimum wage laws is because they theoretically, they discriminate against less skilled workers who are disproportionately young. They are less. They're usually less educated, and if just based on the simple economic principle that people tend to buy, if something increases in price, people tend to buy less of it. And these economists would say the same thing applies to labor. If the government raises the price of labor, then people will buy less of it, or they will substitute that labor for automation and such. And so, Walter E. Williams makes it. Well, okay. Going back to like the rationale behind it, business owners try to calculate how much a certain job or a certain employee produces in value. And so if you increase the minimum wage higher than what they produce in value, then the businesses are going to fire those people, or they're going to find creative ways of changing the hours and including automation and such like that. So Walter E. Williams makes a really interesting argument in his book, Race and Economics: How Much Can Be Blamed on Discrimination. He actually argues that minimum wage laws have been used to price out black laborers out of the labor force. He points out that when the federal government was instituting minimum wage laws in the 1930s, there were politicians and labor union representatives who were saying we can't compete from this low wage labor from Black Americans living in the South. These construction companies and whatever are bringing up these Southern workers that are used to living in poorer conditions, and they're willing to work for less money. So we need to protect ourselves from this competition. And so they were advocating in favor of minimum wage laws or equal pay for equal work laws in order to price out less skilled labor. And then businesses would no longer have an incentive to replace the more highly skilled and more expensive labor with the lower skilled Black American labor. And he points out, or people that were willing to work for less money. And he says that disproportionately affected the unemployment rates among Black American youths. He points out that if you look in the 1940s, where the minimum wages weren't so high, there was so much inflation that the minimum wage was essentially, not important because no one was making that wage. He points out that the unemployment rate for Black teenagers between, I can't remember what age, 16 and 17 or 16 to 18, the unemployment rate for Black American teenagers and white American teenagers was roughly the same, around 10%, give or take. But then, and sometimes it was lower. But then when there were massive minimum wage increases in the 1960s, the unemployment rate for young Black Americans doubled. And it also increased for white Americans, but it particularly hit Black Americans pretty hard. Now, of course, correlation is not proof of causation. Thomas Sowell says that, this is a correlational argument, saying that minimum wage increases lead to a decrease in less skilled labor or younger workers and people who are from disadvantaged communities, especially. He says that it's still a pretty strong correlation, and it's it falls in line with that theory that less skilled labor is discriminated against because what they provide isn't worth the value that they create isn't worth the wage that the employer is forced to pay them. It's important to note, like minimum wage laws, it doesn't raise everybody's minimum wage. It makes it illegal to pay someone less than that wage. And so when I first heard that, I think it was Perb Island, who was an economist. He said something to that effect. And I'll say, that's such an interesting way of framing it. It's not everybody keeps their jobs and their wages go up. It's actually so a lot of people lose their jobs as a result of that.
Yeah, that argument against minimum wage makes a lot of sense. But I will go back to one thing and just kind of stick on this for a bit, which is it's similar to what we said before, right? It's really hard to argue like we should get rid of the minimum wage because it sounds like greedy capitalist, like we're just going to take advantage of all these low wage workers and pay them, $1 an hour and it'll just be terrible. What would you say to someone, who might say, like, even this even applies to me, like I have this gut feeling like it does scare me, like I'm worried people will get taken advantage of, and I'm not for raising the minimum wage to like $25 an hour, but like maybe it should be like $8 an hour or something just to keep it at some level. What would you say to someone like me who's a little nervous about it, who says, the theoretical outline that you gave makes a lot of sense and I largely agree with it, but we should still have like maybe a $8 to $10 minimum wage just to make sure people aren't, being paid a slave wage or something. Is that a reasonable proposition, do you think, or do you think that my worries are just born out of a gut feeling rather than reason?
That's a good question. I mean, the unemployment effects of minimum wage laws are, depend on the magnitude of the minimum wage increase. Ludwig von Mises, I read him recently, he said that, of course, a small earthquake is going to do less damage than a large earthquake. And so if the earthquake is small enough, it may not do any measurable damage. So there does come a point where, if you have a minimum wage if it's low enough, it may not have severe unemployment effects. Even people that advocate for a minimum wage, a lot of them would agree that if you were to raise it to $100 an hour, that would probably have some unemployment effects.
Right.
So yeah, I guess that could be an empirical. Again, that's kind of an empirical question. For economists that are more in favor of interventionism. Again, this is all from a free market perspective. There are plenty of economists that are in favor of minimum wage laws. Paul Krugman is another famous example. He's in favor of raising the minimum wage to a certain level. But how would I respond to someone who has that fear? Here's the thing. So one thing we should be asking is why do we make more wages? Like, why are we wealthier here than people in Bangladesh? Walter E. Williams brings up that example. He says, the argument is that the minimum wage law is an effective anti-poverty tool. And he says, we know that's not the case, because if we were to go to Bangladesh and increase their minimum wage to $20 an hour, that wouldn't improve their economy. The reason why people in Bangladesh or similar countries, I don't want to beat down on Bangladesh right now, but that's an example that's often used in these discussions. The reason why these poorer nations get paid less for their labor is because their labor is less productive than labor here in the United States or in wealthier countries. The more capital has been invested in our tools and factories and such, which makes the average worker produce a lot more, which in turn raises their wages because there's more wealth to go around and distribute. So just the fact that we are so productive, I don't think that there would be a race to the bottom for wages. And and again, kind of like what I was mentioning before, a very small number of people in the United States make the minimum wage. So if it were to be reduced to zero, I don't think people would be getting paid 25 cents an hour. But I don't know.
I can't imagine people would take those jobs most of the time. You'd have to entice them with a certain minimum just organically, right?
Well, and here's the question is, why would you? Yeah, so there's laborers are more productive, and then there's also competition in labor. I mean, companies need to compete against each other to hire the best workers. I have so many anecdotal examples of this. So
just give us one or two.
Yeah, I know. So we tend. I remember I was considering working at Carl's Jr. for a summer to save some money during college. And when I think of Carl's Jr., I think of entry-level job, don't have to do much. But here in the state that I live in, we have pretty high minimum wage compared to other states. And I tried to apply for this job, and it was just ridiculous. It took like an hour to fill out this work application to work at this entry-level position at Carl's Jr. And a free market economist would argue that, well, it's because the minimum wage is so high that they can't take a risk on people who may not produce as much to justify that wage. So they want people that already have job experience because they have to pay them that much. And so in that example, I was like, how can I've heard so many people complain online about how difficult it is for even like kids in high school to find work after school or during the summer, because it's just so competitive, because the minimum wage is so high that you're increasing the demand for that position. More people find it worth it to apply for those jobs, and then the company is able to pick and choose whoever they want. Whereas if you are a less skilled individual with no experience, you should be able to use that as a negotiating technique to work for a lower wage and get your job. I mean, the reason why people take low-paying jobs is because there isn't a better alternative. The reason why people work in sweatshops in foreign nations is because that's the best of all of the alternatives that were presented to them. And so through no fault of their own, there are a lot of people in the United States that aren't desirable workers at a certain minimum wage. And they need the opportunity to be able to increase their skills and their experience and their human capital in order to start their careers and move up the ladder. Then as they get more productive and more experienced, they will earn higher wages.
Now, in keeping with the theme of minimum, I guess we could say minimum wage, but more broadly jobs, I'd love to talk about how AI interacts with the job market. I think you made a video about this. How, correct me if I'm wrong, but the wealthier ones among us will utilize these tools, these technologies, and people will worry about exploitation, perhaps. And again, correct me if I'm messing that up, but I do think it's important to preface with, I'm no Marxist, but this is something that Karl Marx did have his finger on a particular pulse here, thinking of technology under a capitalistic structure as a tool, basically, as a means to an end for increasing surplus value, and essentially leading to alienation and de-skilling and displacing workers. And I think that there is something real about the effect of AI as it pertains to the job market, feeling as if it were a quagmire for some, not sure about where it's going to lead us, and if jobs will eventually be lost to it. And then, of course, on a different level of analysis, there is something called cognitive atrophy, which is something that worries me particularly. People outsourcing their knowledge and their capacity to reason to AI, but getting back to economy and jobs, is this something to worry about? Really, when it pertaining to AI and jobs, or is this something that's just going to be just an evolution that we have to tough it through and kind of evolve with it?
That's a good question. I mean, I share the same fears. I mean, I've been worried about AI, coming from my job as well. I do data analysis and stuff, and I do qualitative, and we do interviews and focus groups, and we do qualitative analyses of these things, and we use a recording app called fireflies.ai, and it records your Zoom meeting, and then it provides a summary of all the key points, and you can get it to identify key themes, and that makes that kind of gets rid of, I mean, it's still questionable now, like you still want human eyes there to make sure that it's doing, that it's correctly interpreting everything that was said. But yeah, I don't blame individuals for thinking this is going to affect my job and how I go about making a living. What's going to happen? I share that same fear, but just from a broad, like something that gives me a little bit of peace of mind is knowing that this argument has been made for hundreds of years. There's a great example in the Why Nations Fail. He talks about William Lee, or they talk about William Lee in 1583, and he had 1589 he had created a stocking frame that was a machine that allowed people to produce textiles much more quickly than people that are just knitting by hand. And he actually went to Queen Elizabeth to get a patent for the machine, and she was quoted in this book as telling him, "Thou aimest high, Master Lee. Consider thou what the invention could do to my poor subjects. It would assuredly bring them to ruin by depriving them of employment, thus making them beggars." So if we had followed through with that fear back in 1589, we would not be at the level of economic well-being as we are today. The whole point of technology is to reduce the amount of labor that it takes to complete a task. So an economist like Henry Hazlitt, he would say that automation is just another labor-saving technology. So people try to make a big difference, say that's a big difference between AI and just more, machines that can do more labor, because those machines still need to be run by somebody. Yeah, even back in 1961, Henry Hazlitt, wrote a book called Man versus the Welfare State in 1969, and he was saying that even in 1961, people were saying automation is going to destroy our jobs, and we need a universal basic income in order to, save people from the loss of employment. And nowadays, people say, if only we could go back to the 1960s when we had so when we had so much manufacturing. It's like they were doing the same thing back then.
Right.
Oh man, I just love reading that old stuff. So yeah, I have no doubt that AI is probably going to be disruptive, but I think that there will always be some sort of use for human labor. Walter E. Williams says it's kind of ridiculous to assume that human beings will have no use for the millions of people that are idle and don't have nothing to do. Like, no doubt the way that we work is going to change, but I think it will be gradual enough that we'll all have incomes in one form or another. Maybe we'll reduce the amount of time we spend laboring. People that want a 4-hour work week, maybe AI is the key to getting, or not 4-hour work week, 4-hour work day. Henry Hazlitt is like, why will that eliminate why will that eliminate employment? Why will automation eliminate employment? We could, some people work on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Other people work, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. And yeah, I just think that this falls into the lump of labor fallacy, the idea that there is a fixed number of jobs, and if you automate all of these jobs, then there will be nothing left to do. It just means that we can use these idle hands to do other things. That's my more optimistic opinion about it. And we also need to take into account that there will be a significant reduction in the greater productivity and a reduction in the cost of goods and services. So if productivity is what leads nations to become wealthy, then we will just become wealthier as we increasingly find ways to save on labor.
It's a very good point. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to choose to be optimistic like you, at least in terms of the jobs aspect of it, of this like AI concern. I will say that actually, like, the big thing that worries me about AI, and maybe it shouldn't worry me, but I think an interesting thing is it presents rather an interesting sort of like dilemma for lovers of the free market like us. Is way back at the beginning of this conversation, we were talking about how socialism, a purely socialist system, or I guess what you could call like a communist system, doesn't work because of the processing power at the center. You can't, even a board of brilliant, a team of brilliant people, brilliant like 160 IQ polymaths couldn't predict at a high enough level and understand at a finely detailed enough level the needs of individuals in a large society enough to get the same results that you get from just a free market. But the thing about AI is, like, and I don't know enough about the technology to know how outlandish this is, if it is, but like, what happens if we develop AI and we develop our computing technology enough to where in 50 and 100 years, 50 to 100 years, I should say, we develop this like super brain that can do that. Like, should we, is there any argument against a communist system is the thing that I think. We don't have to get into it, but I just think it's interesting to think about, like, what happens when that problem with the socialist system is solved by technology that, ironically enough, pretty much came about because of the benefits of a capitalist society, right? That where people can we become rich and we can spend that money on research and all this stuff. And all of a sudden we develop this thing that makes communism make sense. It's just something that I dwell on sometimes. Like, what happens when we can just ask a computer, like,
I think
what should
humanity
the price
declines.
of this be?
I think humanity
so?
declines. Well, just from a biological perspective, I think there would be a regression cognitively. That's for another time. But there is some evidence that this is actually a problem. So,
yeah, I mean, maybe we all just turn into robots.
Yeah.
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 Sorry, go for it.
I thought that too. Like, because Because I was thinking, like, we go to the gym in order to get, people to exercise and get gym memberships in order to build their muscle and go, and, go running to increase the strength of their heart. And I even had that thought too. I was like, I wonder if we're going to have like mental gyms, or, people are going to be like, well, it's my hour of critical thinking time I need to take to keep my brain going well. Yeah, as far as the more dystopian thoughts about AI, like, will it take over all of our, the surveillance issues, or are we going to be constantly surveilled by this super intelligence? That's a different question than the purely economic question, which is, labor saving technology in general leads to an increase in productivity and wealth. It's an exciting time to be alive, for sure. I look forward to this.
we're cursed to live in interesting times, and again, we don't have to like get into it. It's just I just think it's a fun and disturbing, but also interesting thing to think about. It's like maybe it won't be dystopian. Maybe this like supercomputer that we invent one day will just tell us exactly how to live, and even the most diehard, idealistic, freedom-loving people, which I think we're kind of more towards that end of things, I would think. Even we maybe we'll just be like, it's not worth it anymore. We don't have to be free. This computer will solve all our problems, and I can kick back and hang out and not have to worry about anything. And that'll be hard to argue against. It'll feel dystopian, but it like won't be, or maybe it's the other way around. I don't know.
Very interesting.
And I will also say that we already have gym for your brain. The gym for your brain is called books. I mean, come on, like that is like read more books. That's how you work out your brain.
That's
without
the
question.
message of my channel. I'm always like, hey, here's this great book I read. You should check it out.
Yeah, you've already recommended like 30,000 books on this one podcast episode. So
very impressive.
But so we've gone over an hour and a half. We try not to let these episodes run too long. So I think we're going to skip a couple of questions that we had planned and get to just two more. But I will say we were going to ask about housing and rent control and all that stuff. I'll spoil the answer. I bet I could predict more or less what you're going to say, which is build more housing. It'll lower the cost of housing, and rent control doesn't work, and it's a bad idea. Does that about sum it up?
That sums it up. Yeah. It reduces the supply and quality of housing. Yeah, it's just like any other price control. It doesn't respond to the price mechanism, and that. Yeah.
There you go. Yeah, no, we've talked about it before on the podcast, so we don't need to go into it more. That we've talked about a lot in regard to New York and Mamdani and all his proposed ideas. Yeah. So we'll move on. Really, there's one last thing I want to ask about that's kind of in a miscellaneous category that we wrote up here on our list of questions. And I just want to ask about it because actually, I guess now it is kind of relevant for me specifically more than you two, because I live in Texas, and Texas has I live in Austin specifically, has no ability to deal with freezing weather. And so we're getting this storm front coming in at the time of this recording with all this cold weather. And so I went to Costco today just to buy a couple odds and ends because I'm not too worried about it, but it was a madhouse. And so was Home Depot, was a bit of a madhouse, right? With people buying sleeves for their spigots outside and preparing for the cold and all that. And one thing that you'll see people notice in situations like this, not my specific situation, is this price gouging isn't a thing, but they'll notice price gouging in more extreme situations where it's like, okay, this emergency event is about to happen. This natural disaster is about to happen. We can see it. It's a hurricane or it's a whatever it is. And people will go to the store and they're like, okay, I need to stock up on tissue paper and toilet paper and food and water and batteries for my electronics and all these things. And companies will raise their prices. And the typical reaction you get to that is, how could they, these greedy capitalist dogs, how dare they raise prices on necessities like toilet paper and water and rice and all of these things? It's so horrible of them. But I'm not quite sure that that's the case, actually. And so I was wondering if my instincts are true in this instance, Colin, that actually raising the prices of things is good because it stops people from buying out something that other people need. So in the case of famously with COVID, for some reason it was toilet paper. If I'm freaking out, I'm going to have to take 1 million dumps and I need all the toilet paper in this Costco during the course of this natural disaster, I'm going to buy all of the toilet paper. That means that everyone else that is going to Costco can't stock up on toilet paper, and maybe it is a good idea to get a little bit extra, but I probably don't need a year's worth, right? And so what happens if they raise the prices, I might think to myself, well, I don't want to spend that much money on a year's worth of toilet paper, so I'll only buy a month's worth. And that means that toilet paper is left over for other people to buy in relatively moderate quantities. So is that logic, does that strike you as correct? And what's a good book to read that can back me up? Because I know you have one.
Yeah. So, anti-price gouging laws are usually instituted in order to protect people that have been affected by some sort of disaster or some sort of emergency situation. If there is an earthquake and a whole bunch of buildings and factories have been destroyed, there is a scarcity of resources that people need, and people will criticize businesses that raise prices because, how dare you exploit these people who are suffering? Walter E. Williams wrote a book, or not a book. He wrote an article called "It's Not
Close enough.
It's not price gouging; it's the free market." The price system is useful in normal times and in times of emergency because prices will incentivize people to, if the price goes up, people are incentivized to conserve on whatever necessities they want to buy. If government comes in and keeps the price too low, there will be shortages and people will hoard these supplies, and there isn't enough for everyone to go around. If there's a blackout or expected blackouts, people may want to buy a flashlight. If companies aren't allowed to charge higher for flashlights, they charge higher prices for flashlights, then a family may buy 4 flashlights, for each member of the family. But if they increase due to the increase in demand relative to the supply of flashlights, then people will economize and maybe just buy 1 flashlight. So allowing prices to rise in an emergency situation are important to prevent hoarding and to conserve these resources that are scarce. You can't get around that. Like, no matter what you do with the prices, people want a lot and there isn't enough to go around. And the other reason why prices should be allowed to rise in a disaster situation is that it encourages businesses and producers to produce more of those necessities that people want because they will get higher profits. And then when there is an increase in the supply, then the price will come down. Gary Becker, I don't have the book with me, but Gary Becker and Richard Posner wrote some articles. Their book is called Uncommon Sense, and it's a collection of their blog articles that they wrote in the early 2000s. And he points out, Hurricane Katrina was a big disaster that hit the southern United States, and people were critical of the oil companies for raising prices of oil because a lot of the oil manufacturers were hit hard by the hurricane. But he pointed out that because there was a restricted supply, they could charge higher profits that encouraged the producers that were still functioning to produce more than they were before, and then it encouraged those oil companies to get back online faster. So if it sounds bad that you're going to earn profits in a disaster scenario, but if you really want to alleviate the shortage, then you need to allow people to earn profits off of supplying what people need in a national emergency or state, local national emergency.
Yeah, the utilitarian argument is pretty clear. I mean, if toilet paper is gone in the blinking of an eye, then what good does that do for your community? I mean, if you want to kind of impose a moral argument upon it, price gouging could be the thing that actually helps in one way or another.
Well, again, prices just communicate information about
Right.
what the reality is on the ground. I mean,
Exactly.
the fact is there just isn't enough to go around. There's been a sharp decrease in the supply or a great increase in demand. And yeah, that's what the prices are for, to incentivize and to economize.
I want to ask, we're going to ask 2 more questions, but they're super short ones, then we'll wrap up. One thing I actually am curious about, because you've listed, I mean, I joked about it earlier, like 30 books or something, like maybe not quite that, maybe like 15 or 20 books in this podcast, which is great. I love it. And I'm going to list them all in the show notes. But I'm curious about just if you had to recommend 2 or 3 of them for someone who's like listening to this podcast and thinking to themselves, man, this is so interesting. I want to get into reading about economics more. What are 2 or 3 good examples of some of the books you've listed or others that are both informative but accessible to like a layman?
Yeah, thanks. I came prepared, thankfully. So, yeah, I made a video about this too, but yeah, the 3 books that I recommend, I'm sure there will be a lot of debate in the comments section. You know, anybody who comments on this will be like, no, you got to read this book. You got to read this book. But just from my personal experience, I really like this book by the economist Henry Hazlitt called Economics in One Lesson. And this one was published in 1979, or it was originally published in the 40s, but it's been updated. And, you know, it just goes through so many relevant issues that we are still debating and discussing today. You know, it says, do tariffs save jobs? Why is free trade important? Like what rent control does? Why minimum wage laws may be counterproductive? And it's a very short and easy way to understand these, economic principles as they're applied to the real world around us. This is another one. It's larger. It has, what is it, 600 something pages, but it is very easy to read. Thomas Sowell wanted to write a book that didn't have a lot of numbers and charts and graphs, and so he wrote Basic Economics. Again, this kind of goes through most of the issues that we've already talked about. So you mentioned that I share so many books on my channel and then on here, but when I first started, I even considered, I was like, I could make a whole channel just dedicated to this book. Like I could just, like, every argument that's coming out, I was like, I can reference it here. And, Thomas Sowell has referenced it. So even if you don't want to read the full 600 pages, it's good. The first 120 pages are absolutely excellent. And then you can look throughout. He discusses prices and their role in society, and then he compares free market economies to centrally planned economies. And
yeah,
then,
Thomas Sowell is the GOAT, as the kids would say.
Yeah, he's my favorite author. I mean, people will say that the ideas in this book aren't original, but he communicates in a way that's just so easy to understand. Another one is, this was actually referenced by the UFC fighter. Do you remember when at UFC, what's his name? Renato Moicano or something, the Brazilian guy?
Yes, I saw that.
There at UFC, and he's like, he's like, if you love your country, he's like, I love private property rights. He's like, if you love your country, then read Ludwig von Mises' 8 lessons for for understanding the economy. And in English, it's called Economic Policy, Thoughts for Today and Tomorrow. So he was like, read that book, mother effers. And so this is that book. Ludwig von Mises has written a lot on all of these topics. I think his writing style is a little more complex than, say, Sowell or Henry Hazlitt, but this is a good primer for Ludwig von Mises, who makes a lot of excellent arguments about why a free and open market is superior to socialist, centrally planned economies. Yeah, his magnum opus is called Human Action. I'm still reading this. I'm on page like 180. This is a massive book. It's really hard to understand. So he's written a lot of smaller books that are much easier to understand, and that's one of them. So those are my 3 top recommendations for people that want to understand basic economic principles and how they apply to all of these policy discussions that we are having online and in politics and such.
Very nice.
Right.
Now, are there any popular books, economic books in particular, that perhaps mislead people or get important things wrong?
I can't think of any well,
Or maybe not books, but just tropes or articles or people, even personalities that you might think or might be
yeah,
comfortable.
I took some notes on that, but so I was reading a book called, what was it? Principles of Economics by Seyfedin Amus, and he spends a lot of time criticizing mainstream economics textbooks. So there's a branch of economic thought called the Austrian School of Economics, because it
Right.
originated with Austrian authors, and so he presents a lot of criticisms of mainstream economics and promotes the kind of the Austrian school of thought. I know a lot of people are critical of how history textbooks portray the Great Depression. A lot of textbooks will say that FDR saved the United States and the market economy from its own destruction with massive government programs, and a lot of the economists that I reference on my channel are very they disagree significantly. They would argue that the government got too involved, and that's why the Depression lasted as long as it did. And even in that book, Principles of Economics, he's also talking about a book by an author named Paul Samuelson. And up until the 80s, he was writing that in his textbook that was widely read, he was arguing that the Soviet economy was extremely efficient and was going to surpass the U.S. economy. And he had made predictions that by 1984 or 1989, Russia and the Soviet Union is going to exceed the U.S. in production, and they are proof that command economies are more efficient. And then the Soviet Union collapsed, and a lot of these textbooks, removed their. Seyfedin Amus says they removed their textbooks, but they didn't bother to criticize the thinking that made them make such terrible predictions. So, that's all I can probably say about that issue. But yeah.
Well, that makes sense. You wouldn't waste your time with bad econ textbooks, right? So you mostly read the good stuff.
I need to.
Books, not
I admit I need to read more of people that disagree with me. Like, I've been slowly reading through a collection of essays by Paul Krugman. I mean,
okay.
he's an economist. He was a New York Times writer. He's very much in favor of government intervention. I mean, he's still in favor of free trade, and he's critical of rent controls and stuff, but he's very much in favor of massive government welfare spending and taxes. And so, like, I've just been slowly reading through his book, and my goal this year is to read more books by people who disagree with me. So, yeah.
I think that's a good goal. My goal is to just read more books. I've got a big stack of them. And thanks to you, Colin, the stack has gotten like 20 books larger. So I don't know how I'm going to fit in all this reading. My reading spans from like Civil War history to climate change to now a bunch of economics books. So I think I'm going to have a big muscular brain by the end of the year if everything goes according to plan.
Yeah, I wish I read these books. I wish I knew these books existed when I was younger. So I hope that, maybe I can get a slightly younger audience that can, make up the lost ground that I had. I didn't start reading this stuff until I was in my early 30s. So this is, even for me, I'm still learning a lot.
Yeah, I mean, if I had a penny for every time I was like, damn, why didn't I know this earlier? Why didn't I read? Yeah. I do the same thing. I'll read a book and be like, oh my God, why did it take me so long to read this? So I'm sure you're not alone. I'm sure we're not the only people. But we've done a nice long podcast today. It's over, or at least our recording time. Maybe after I edit it, it'll be a little shorter than this, but we're at over 2 hours right now. So I want to say thank you so much.
Pick and choose what you like. But, yeah.
No, it's great. This was great. You satisfied my curiosity. I'm sure it's the same for Anthony. And I can't recommend your channel to people enough. We'll link to it in the show notes as always. Yeah, thank you for joining us, and thank you everyone for listening, and we will catch you in the next one. Toodaloo.